know, this is our third installment in our series on talks about the last Mexican election and the aftermath. You were able to see and hear a different position. Now we have a different position. We are very happy to host a lecture by Professor François Prud'homme from the Colegio de Mexico. He's the academic secretary of the equivalent to the dean, academic dean of the Colegio de Mexico in Mexico, and he's a political scientist by training. Has worked extensively in topics dealing with electoral policies, parties, and recently has edited and published 2 volumes together with one with Guy Hermet and Al Casanquil on La Gouvernance, and one edited with the same Hermet and Soledad Loesa, del populismo de los antiguos al populismo de los modernos. And with this lecture we will finish our analysis and examination of the recent elections. I just want to remind you of other events for this week. Tomorrow we have Professor Stanton speaking on Octavio Paz and Pablo Neruda. And Wednesday we have an event by Frank Contreras speaking on the recent events in Oaxaca. So please remember and please welcome Professor Jean-François Prud'homme.
Yes, thank you, Mauricio. It's a pleasure for me to be here at the CATS Center and to have the opportunity to share my reflections on the Mexican presidential elections with you. Basically, I decided to start my presentation going back a few months ago. 4 weeks before the July 2nd election, I started a presentation on this topic with the following introduction. So, a few years ago, I was saying at the time, I would have started this brief talk on Mexican elections stressing one of the following elements. First, the possibility of fair, reliable, and transparent elections. And second, the odds of a pre-defeat and thereof of taking turns in office following the elections. At that time, at the beginning of June 2006, I was saying that times have changed and I'm forced to be much more cautious in my approach to the 2006 electoral process in Mexico. Today, I was saying at the time, for the first time, these elections are considered as normal democratic elections with all the advantages and disadvantages that those elections have. Well, I was partly wrong. So tonight, in trying to explain why I was wrong, I will address 3 issues in this presentation. So I will first give an assessment of the electoral campaign. Then I will talk briefly about the post-electoral conflict, and I will finish with a few reflections on the prospects for governability in the Mexican political system. As you all know, what was at stake in the election, the last election, was first the presidency. It's a 6 years mandate. The Congress, there are 500 seats in the Chamber of Deputies. 300 of them are plurality seats. 200 of them are proportional seats. The mandate of the legislature is a 3 years mandate. And then also, there was an election for the Senate. There are 128 seats in the Senate It's a 6 years mandate. Half of the senators are elected by plurality system, 32 of them are elected by a proportional system, and 32 of them are elected as representing the first minority in each of the 32 states of Mexico. There was also an election for the head of government of the federal district and for the legislative assembly of the federal district, and then a few governorships, some local legislatures, and also city governments. Okay, who were the contenders in the election? Well, the first contender was Andrés Manuel López Obrador. As you know, he was the candidate for the Coalición por el Bien de Todos. That coalition included the PRD, Andrés Manuel López Obrador own political party, the small political party called Convergencia Democrática, and another small political party called Partido del Trabajo. Basically, the political orientation of that Coalición por el Bien de Todos can be defined in a nutshell as a center-left political platform. The coalition was built around the personality of Andrés Manuel López Obrador, so we can say that it was a coalition organized around one individual, and that individual political discourse appealed basically to a strongly rooted populist culture in Mexican politics. The other coalition was the Alianza por México. It was composed of the PRI and the Partido Verde Ecológico Mexicano. The candidate was Roberto Madrazo, and basically we can define its political orientation as a center pragmatic. And also the Partido Acción Nacional was competing in the election. The candidate was Felipe Calderón. The political orientation can be defined as center-right, and as you all know, it is still the governing party in Mexico. And finally, there were two new small political parties that were competing: the Alianza Socialdemócrata y Campesina. Its candidate was Patricia Mercado, and that political party can be defined as a center-left political party with a strong emphasis on civil rights issues. In a certain way, we could say that it was a more modern leftist option if we compare it with the Coalición por el Bien de Todos. And finally, there was another small political party called Partido Nueva Alianza. Its candidate was Roberto Campa, an ex-member of the PRI, and curiously, its political orientation was liberal in the traditional political sense of the word, but I guess that its most salient feature was its close relationship with the teachers' union in Mexico, the CENTE. What were the issues of the campaign? Well, basically, everybody, well, as you know, those campaigns, electoral presidential campaigns in Mexico are very, very long. Officially, they last a little bit more than 5 months and a half. It's very hard to sustain the interest of the electorate during those 5 months and a half. They tend to be also very costly. But I guess that during this election, this campaign, there are 3 elements that should be noted. First, as in many democratic countries, there was not much importance given to the debate of public policies. So basically, the candidates were not discussing topics closely associated to public policies. Nevertheless, even if there was no debate around specific public policies, we can say that the distribution of political support was clearly divided between left and right. So there was a certain effect of polarization at the level of the political discourse. And I guess that one way to explain this apparent ideological division would be to see a confrontation between, I don't know, what we can call a nostalgic proposal where there was a certain vision of what was the golden age of the post-revolutionary politics in Mexico against something that can be labeled as neoliberal, but that was also much more oriented towards the future. Or we can also say that it was a nationalistic project against a certain idea of opening towards a globalized world. Another element that was very important in the electoral campaign was the predominance and the efficacy of political marketing techniques. It's something that should not surprise an American public, but in Mexico there was the idea that negative advertising did not work as a device for communication device for an electoral campaign. In the year 2000, one of the candidates tried to use negative advertising, and people were saying that it backfired and that it did not work at the time. This time, Felipe Calderón first, and then Andrés Manuel López Obrador used the negative advertising, and it seems that it was very efficient. It was so efficient that it became one of the reasons why it seems that it became one of the reasons why after the election there was a ground for polarization between the two main political forces. If we look very rapidly at the evolution of electoral preferences during the electoral campaign, we can see that there were basically three phases during the long electoral campaign. So the first phase would be from January to more or less to the end, until the end of the month of April. And during that phase, Andrés Manuel López Obrador had a very clear lead over his main rivals. He sustained in a consistent way a 10 points lead over the other candidates. Why was it so? Basically because the attempt to impeach López Obrador while he was mayor of Mexico City brought him a lot of sympathy, not only amongst his supporters, but also with the large segment of independent voters. At the same time, Felipe Calderón, who was the candidate from the PAN, had a very low level of recognition in the electorate. Felipe Calderón was not the favorite in the nomination process of the Partido Acción Nacional, and even if he was known to the people with a more developed political culture, he was not known to the public in general. And then the three had problems at a problem that became persistent during the whole electoral campaign. And those problems had to do basically with two things. First, there was a problem of cohesion and political conflicts within the PRI, and also Roberto Madrazo had a very serious problem of public image. Roberto Madrazo was not able to attract the favors or the preferences of the independent voters. So that would be for the first phase of the election, of the campaign, up until the month of April. Then in the second phase, what we saw was a combination of factors that helped Felipe Calderón to take the lead in the electoral preferences. What happened? Basically, Andrés Manuel López Obrador entered into a process of confrontation with some political figures and with some groups or associations. The fact that he entered into a confrontation with those groups did not really, in itself, did not affect his image, but if you combine it with the negative political advertising that was aired by the Felipe Calderón's campaign at that time, it helped to affect the image of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And the other important factor was that Andrés Manuel López Obrador had a strategic or tactic mistake when he decided not to participate in the first public debate amongst the candidates. Felipe Calderón, at the same time, as I was saying, used a clever deployment of negative propaganda against López Obrador on the one hand, and on the other hand, decided to reorient his political campaign, electoral campaign, in order to present a much more, attractive image. And in the case of Madrazo, the problems of the internal conflicts within the PRI remained, and that's when Madrazo started to lag behind the other candidates. And I would say that the third phase of the electoral campaign, which starts in June, shows a tie between Andrés Manuel López Obrador and Felipe Calderón. And basically, what we saw at that time was that the electoral confrontation was mainly between López Obrador and Calderón. After the first debate, López Obrador decided to reorganize his electoral strategy. He decided to use more and more the media in order to improve his image. And he also started to, after the second debate, to use negative propaganda to counteract the efforts of Calderón's spinning efforts after the second debate. So 10 days before the election, most polls gave a very slight advantage to Andrés Manuel López Obrador. We are thinking of a 2 points advantage for Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Only 2 polls from groups associated with Felipe Calderón gave Felipe Calderón as the winner of the election. But we can say that there was a technical tie between López Obrador and Felipe Calderón. At that time, and it's important to mention it, at that time people were thinking that basically the strategic vote of the Madrazo supporter was going to favor Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and there was a general opinion that López Obrador was going to win the election. Okay, so what happened in the election? I guess that we all know what happened, what were the results. So when we look at the results, we can appreciate that the PRI had a collapse, so the center of the political party system collapsed, and that the PAN and the PRD almost ended in a virtual tie with a very, very slight margin in favor of Felipe Calderón. So it was a very close call, and as it happens in most democratic systems, when there is a slight difference between the winner and the runner-up, it puts a lot of pressure on the electoral institutions. And it also, in the case of Mexico and in the case of, how would I call it, young democracies, it also put to the test the loyalty of political actors towards the institutions. When we look closely at the results, we can see that the PAN and the PRD, this is the result for the Chamber of Deputies, had a net gain of 58 deputies in the case of the PAN and 30 deputies in the case of the PRD. So the PRD lost the presidential election, or it seemed at that point that it had lost the presidential election, but it was the PRD's best score in a legislative election since its creation in 1989. So the results of the election were lived as an electoral defeat on the side of the PRD, but if you look closely to the results, it was a very, very good result for the PRD. And it's important because when you look at it, you can imagine that the PRD could have opted for another post-electoral strategy. But I guess it's a problem of choice, and it's a problem of diagnosis of the political situation. Another thing that is very important is the fact that the PRI virtually collapsed. And it's important because if we think that the Mexican party system is a system that is organized around three main political parties and a diversity of small political parties, and that the PRI used to be at the center of that political party system, it means that there was a certain collapse of that political center. And the effect of the collapse of the political center in that party system meant that there was, at least at the level of the political discourse, there was the possibility to picture the Mexican political system as a system polarized between the left and the right, something that was relatively new in the Mexican political history. So basically what we have is a party system, parties that are represented in the Chamber of Deputies organized around the PAN and the PRD, with the PRI with a smaller delegation, and with also the presence of 5 small political parties. Okay, if we also look at the results of the election, we can appreciate that there is a north-south geographical division in terms of political representation. Basically, people have said after the election that there was a Mexico from the north and a Mexico from the south. So the wealthiest Mexico was dominated by the PAN, and the poorest Mexico of the south was basically dominated by the PRD. There is a part of truth in that affirmation, but at the same time, if we look more closely, state by state, we can see that this is Baja California Sur, Zacatecas, and Michoacán, we can appreciate that it's not exactly true. And if we analyze more in detail the results of the election, we can come to the conclusion that the distribution of the vote is much more geographically widespread than it looks like at first sight. Okay, what is the profile of the voters of the three main candidates? We do not have much information yet on the profile of the voters, but if we analyze the exit polls, we can see that Felipe Calderón received more support from women than men, that people who were worrying about the issue of insecurity more than people who were worrying about unemployment voted in favor of Felipe Calderón, and that's the important data, that 9 out of 10 people who approve President Fox's administration voted in favor of Felipe Calderón. Otherwise, the profile of the people who voted for Calderón is, according to this exit poll, is not very different from the profile of the people who voted in favor of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. López Obrador received support mostly from men. Poverty was and social inequality were the most important issues for the people who voted for Calderón. 4 out of 10 people who approved President Fox's administration voted for López Obrador, and the other important thing is that until the end, López Obrador managed to maintain a stronger support from the independent voters, the people who do not identify with any political parties. And then we can look at Roberto Madrazo. Roberto Madrazo voters were mostly women. They had the lowest levels of literacy and income. 5 out of 10 of those people approved President Fox's administration, and he was the one who managed to gather less support from independent voters. So what would be the conclusion of the results, or what? First, that Mexico, that the election still produced, once again, a divided government, that there is a prospect for a pan-PRI legislative coalition, and also that there is a party or a block of parties, the Frente Amplio Progresista, which are flirting with anti-system strategies. I'll come back on those conclusions at the end of my presentation. Okay, now we can go to the second issue that I wanted to address. And basically, the question I'm asking myself is how an apparently normal situation turned into a post-electoral conflict. And I'm trying to answer or to explain why I was partly wrong, as most political observers at the beginning of the month of June. So, okay, so it all started very well. So on July the 2nd, there was a relatively high turnout, 58.5% of the electorate. There were very few complaints on the electoral day, maybe with the exception of the traditional complaint regarding the lack of ballots in the special polling stations, the polling stations for the people who are not voting in their districts, but this happens in all Mexican elections. And according to the campaign's headquarters and to the foreign and national electoral observers, at the end of the day, everybody was saying that it had been an exemplary voting day. So when did it start to go wrong? Around 10 o'clock that night. So basically, what happened on the night of July the 2nd? First, the Electoral Authority, the IFE, which organizes since the year 2000 a rapid count to announce the electoral results before the electoral results, which are the official electoral results, which are programmed to take place 3 days after. The Electoral Authority informed that the race was too close to call. So the Electoral Authority had stated before that if there was a difference inferior to 1% between the winner and the runner-up, it was not going to announce the results of the rapid count. Then, also, at the same time, the returns from the program of preliminary returns, the PREP, showed a consistent tendency in favor of Calderón, although those returns were incomplete, first, and also that those returns are essentially random returns, so they do not mark any formal tendency in the results. Okay, in that situation, around midnight, both Calderón and Andrés Manuel López Obrador decided to proclaim their victory. And then the situation started to deteriorate. The following Monday, it is announced that the PREP's results were incomplete. Parties and the IFE, nobody knew that, but the parties and the IFE decided months before, the month of March, that they were not going to publish the returns from the polling stations where there were inconsistencies. So there was a certain amount of electoral returns that were not known to the public. But neither the IFE or the parties publicized the existence of the agreement. And they didn't publicize neither the existence of those hidden archives. So from then on, a perfect election day turned into a post-electoral conflict. Was it expected? Yes and no. Most political observers thought that an Andrés Manuel López Obrador defeat by a small margin could lead to a post-electoral conflict. So it was not a surprise to most of the analysts and the political observers. This is why, a month before the election, the IFE managed to negotiate a pact of civility between the political parties. And everybody thought that that pact of civility was enough to guarantee the absence of political conflict or post-electoral conflict. It was wrong also. Why was it so? Well, I guess that there are many reasons to it. But I guess that one of the important reasons has to do with the fact that Andrés Manuel López Obrador, the people from the Coalición por el Bien de Todos, and I would say most political observers believe that Andrés Manuel López Obrador was going to win the election. And there was no B plan. I think that Andrés Manuel López Obrador and the people in his campaign headquarters thought that he was going to win the election, and they did not think about what to do in case that he was not going to win the election. So, 3 days after, there was the official count of the votes. In fact, it's not the official count of the vote, it's the official validation of the votes that have been counted on the night of the election. There is a possibility of a recount, but the recount is allowed strictly on, how would I call them, arithmetical basis, in case that there are discrepancies between the number of ballots and the number of votes that have been counted. Then there is a possibility to have a recount, and in fact, at that time, 2,500 ballot boxes were counted again in that process. And that gave the result with the difference of 244,934 votes in favor of Felipe Calderón. Under the Mexican law, all parties have 4 days to contest the results before the Electoral Tribunal. And then the Electoral Tribunal makes a final decision. Okay, so what was basically the PRD strategy at that time? I would say that there was a twofold contestation strategy. One that was legal, and the other one was a political strategy of contestation of the results. The legal strategy was based on 2 things. First one, there were 2 ways to the legal strategy. The first way was the arithmetical way. So basically it had to do with the recount of the votes. So the PRD asked or contested the result in more than half of the polling stations, around 70,000, on electoral legal ground. In the end, those 70,000 amounted to, number figures not here, but to 46,000 polling stations where there was a legal documentation to support the contestation of the PRD. At the same time, the PRD was saying that because there were no fair, equal, and transparent general conditions for the realization of the election, that for those reasons, they were also asking for a general recount of the election, casilla por casilla, voto por voto. The tribunal, in a first decision, agreed upon a recount of more or less 12,000 polling stations, the returns from 12,000 polling stations, which amounts to 9% of the polling stations, but rejected the possibility of a general recount. And then the PRD was also pursuing a contestation on the base of ethical arguments. So basically they were saying that the unfairness of the election could lead to their nullification. Okay. But the PRD decided, as you all know, not only to follow the legal strategy, but it also followed a political strategy. And the political strategy was based essentially on post-electoral mobilization. Was voto por voto, casilla por casilla, the blockade of Reforma and the Zócalo, and basically the use of what we can call in political science an anti-system strategy. I guess that what was at stake there, and the PRD was looking or wanted the members of the tribunal to take a decision not only on legal grounds, but also on political ground. The idea was that there would be problems of governability in Mexico, that the election was not as fair as people would have expected, and they wanted the judges, the 7 judges, to make basically a political decision. And from the decisions that were taken by the judges, we can say that the judges decided that the decision was going to be a legal decision. It was going to be based only and strictly on legal arguments. Good, so what happened? So the tribunal resolved that there were no legal grounds to nullify the election and that the partial recount did not affect seriously the general results. More or less, there were something like 264,000 votes that were nullified in the recount, but it was not enough to change the overall results. Tribunal also decided to reprimand President Fox because he made some out-of-place comments in order to favor his party candidate during the election. I guess that if we compare it with what happens normally in an American election, the President Fox's interventions were very, very, very mild and not very direct, because basically what he said was he did not support directly his party candidate, but he said that he expressed a lot of criticism against populism during the electoral campaign, and he said at one point that sometimes it's good to change the jockey, but not to change the horse. So that was basically why he was reprimanded. And then also there was a business association that aired some negative advertisement against López Obrador, but then again it was not very clear, because even though they were not allowed to do it, there were no legal sanctions for that type of intervention. So then the PRD and Andrés Manuel López Obrador decided to continue their mobilization. They decided not to concede the election to Calderón and to create a parallel government. Okay. So I'll skip a few figures. So what are the conclusions that we can express against that after that situation? Well, I guess that this whole situation is not very encouraging for the electoral institutions in Mexico. The general opinion before the election, that was also my opinion, was that the Mexican electoral institutions were very solid, sound, and that the problems of electoral governance belong to the past. And generally, the electoral reform agenda seemed oriented more towards flexibility and cost reduction than towards trust building. That phase of trust building that had been the main issue in the whole electoral reform process in Mexico seemed to belong to the past. And it seems that it is not so. So it's very hard now to say how it affected the confidence or the trust of the people in the electoral elections in Mexico. It depends on the polls. Some polls are saying that still 50% of the Mexican electorate thought that there were irregularities or fraud in the last election. The other 50% thinks differently. According to other polls, the proportion of the people who think that there were irregularities in the last election is around 20%, but anyway, it's not, there is still an important segment of the population who do not trust the electoral authorities. The problem is that what can be the alternative to the actual model of electoral governance? I don't see any. Frankly, I don't see any. The model is based on incremental institution building. Throughout the 90s, there were a series of electoral reform that basically were aimed at building trust between the main political parties and between the electorate and the electoral institutions. That model is based fundamentally on citizens' participation at two levels. More than 900,000 people participated in the organization of the election day. Citizen participation also through the nomination of citizens to the General Council of IFE. Those are the people who take the main decisions regarding the organization and supervision of the or surveillance of the elections. It is also based on the participation of a huge number of professional civil servants. The political parties are a very important actor in the process because basically the legislation, the electoral legislation depends on the political parties. The parties are the one who agree upon the designation of the members of the General Council of the IFE, and they participate in all of the different phases of the organization of the elections. And maybe I should add that there is a fourth element, which is the judicial branch through the electoral tribunal. And what did we find out after the election? Well, we found out that the citizens were not perfect. First, there were problems of communication or problems of handling the situation on the part of the members of the General Council of the IFE. Then we realized that the 900,000 citizens who participated in the organization of the election were normal and ordinary Mexican citizens. It means that there were people with an average of a second year of high school. Those people maybe were not very skilled at, I don't know, in mathematics and so on and so forth. So there were also mistakes in the organization of the electoral day. The professional civil servants were not as efficient as people were thinking. The political parties were very, very untrustable partner for the people at IFE because they showed no loyalty to the institution. Basically, the episode of the program of electoral returns showed that even if the parties already knew about the agreement with the authorities of IFE, they decided not to talk about the agreement. So on the day of the election, so this is why Felipe Calderón decided to say that the tendencies or the trends were benefiting him level of the PREP, and this is also why López Obrador decided to say that there were 1,500,000 votes that had been lost, whereas both knew where those results were and they knew about the agreement. So it's a model that is not perfect, but I don't see any alternative model to that model. So what conclusion can be drafted from this post-electoral conflict? First, I think that democratic institutions in Mexico are still very fragile. I was reading today that in a poll, 76% of the Mexicans were saying that they believed in democratic institutions, that they thought that it was the best system of government. But at the same time, what we can see is that in very difficult situations, the main political actors are not always very loyal to the democratic institutions. And we can see that those democratic institutions are very, very fragile. For example, when we think in terms of what went wrong in the election, for example, it seems that the use of negative advertising was something that contributed to create a climate of political polarization. However, when I was watching on TV 3 weeks ago in Virginia, the campaign for the Senate between Webb and Allen, it seemed, that in Mexico the negative advertisement was very mild in comparison with what politicians do here in the US. Same thing can be said about the support that the president gave to his party's candidate. In the end, it was a certain type of support, but it was not what I would call a very overt support to the PAN candidate. So basically, it is a situation that has to be perfect. It has to be perfect, otherwise there are possibilities that some actors decide not to acknowledge the results of the election. Then there is the problem of the political parties. The whole model of electoral governance in Mexico, in the end, is still based on the political parties. It depends if the political parties can agree upon the possibility of reforming the electoral law. It depends if the political party can be in a certain way loyal to the political institutions. And I think that the political parties have problems with those two elements. What is predominating is more the competition between the political parties. So there is still an horizontal among political parties and vertical institutions and the citizenship problem of political distrust in the Mexican political system. And then I would say that there is also, what we saw is that there is still a difficulty to internalize democratic values. And I'm saying so not just in terms of what people think are democratic values, but more in terms of internalizing strategies that allow for the strengthening of the democratic institutional rules of the game. I think that the political parties still think, or the political class in general, still think in terms of short-term strategies, veto and short-term strategies. It's very hard for them to think in terms of middle or long-term strategies. So finally, we have the impression that those political forces are, it's very easy for them to use their veto powers, but it's very hard for them to think in terms of strategies that would strengthen democracy. The third aspect that I wanted to touch, I will do it very briefly. So what are the prospects for the future of the Mexican political system? Well, first, if we look at the actors, the parties, okay, first, maybe it is important. It's going to depend a lot on what the people in the PRD are going to do in the next months. As you may know, the PRD and the other two parties who compose the Coalición por el Bien de Todos created a few weeks ago, a Frente Amplio Progresista. So the idea is to maintain the electoral coalition with the PRD's partners in order to have a common legislative strategy over the next 3 years. I don't know really what is going to happen with that Frente Amplio Progresista. Up until now, it has been able to maintain itself, even though some of the parties have shown differences with the PRD. Then, within the PRD, there is a very strong tension, or there are tensions between the strategies of cooperation and what I would call strategy anti-system strategies. So this past weekend, there was a National Council of the PRD. It was the first time that together the party was analyzing the results of the election and trying to define its strategy for the future. And basically what we have seen is that there were tensions between different sectors within the party, but that what I would call the anti-system strategy still dominated the National Council of the PRD. And basically it means that the PRD decided that they were still going to support Andrés Manuel López Obrador's strategy of social mobilization. And I guess that in the 10 days between November the 20th, when the López Obrador legitimate inauguration is going to take place in the Zócalo of Mexico City, and December 1st, when Felipe Calderón's inauguration is going to take place, I think that it will be very important to see what's going to happen during those 10 days in order to see what will be the strategic course of the PRD in the future. And then the PRD has another problem, which has to do with a problem that was theoretically addressed by Max Weber many years ago, and that's the problem of the routinization of charisma. What will the PRD do with Andrés Manuel López Obrador? Because basically Andrés Manuel López Obrador power within the PRD has all the features of the charismatic power as defined by the German sociologist. In spite of the electoral defeat for the governor elections in Tabasco, which is Andrés Manuel López Obrador regional stronghold, as I was saying, this past weekend, the National Council of the PRD decided that it reiterated its support for Andrés Manuel López Obrador, even though I suspect that there is going to be more and more tensions between the people who favor what I would call a mobilization or anti-system strategy and the people who favor a more institutional strategy. To that, I guess that we have to add the problem in Oaxaca, where the PRD tried to keep a very healthy distance from the APO and the social protest groups in Oaxaca. But lately, what we have seen is that there is a certain convergence between the PRD and the APO. So all that is going to be important in the strategical definitions of the PRD in the next weeks and in the next months. The case of the PRI, very briefly, it is still divided with, it is a party that is still divided, that has not found a way to replace the authority, principle of authority that that was represented by the President of the Republic. They will renew their leadership at the beginning of next year, and I guess that what is going to happen within the PRI, or who's going to be the new leader of the PRI and the way they will renew their leadership will tell us a lot about how the PRI is going to behave in the next future. Finally, I've been talking a lot, the issue of governability or government. Well, I think that again, what we will see in the next 6 years is a situation of divided government where many actors have a strong veto power. So this is not, Felipe Calderón will need support from a fraction of the PRI delegation, both in the Chamber of Deputies and in the Senate. He would need the support at least of 45 deputies from the PRI in the Chamber of Deputies, 14 senators, and support from some members of the Partido Verde, Nueva Alianza, and Alternativa. But I think it's going to be very difficult for Felipe Calderón, even though his strategy is much more parliamentarian than Vicente Fox's strategy, even though he has a more low-profile strategy than Vicente Fox, even though if he knows better the Mexican political institutions, I think that he will have problems, basically because he faces a block of parties that will be flirting with anti-system strategy. So what we can expect is a very complex political interplay where the political efficiency of the democratic institutions will be again put to the test. So I don't think we cannot expect very spectacular measures coming from a Calderón administration, because I think that the structural conditions are going to play against those possibilities. And that will be it. Thank you. Okay. Yes.
I was in Mexico City during the election, and what I saw was a very, very excited, positive, mature electorate, and a very immature party process. And I contrast that with the United States, where we don't get the kind of turnout that they had in Mexico City. It was so impressive. How excited people were to be voting, how excited they were about participating in the process, and they knew that it might be difficult or close, but they were ready to do it. Versus here, where we get such low turnouts, even in the most critical times, and the parties are completely sophisticated and mature and slick, and it seems that the people just get less and less interested, intelligent, enthusiastic, they're apathetic, they're ignorant, they don't pay attention, and that's why we have the kind of campaigning that we do. I mean, I'm more optimistic about the electoral process in Mexico and about democracy in Mexico, because I see this enthusiasm of the people, their hunger for this, and the parties need to catch up. Does that have any resonance?
Well, as I was telling you, 76% of the people in Mexico value very, very highly democracy, the democratic system of government. 58.5% turnout in Mexico is very low, because usually the turnout is, well, it's not very low, but it's lower than in most presidential elections. Yeah, people are enthusiastic about democracy, but at the same time, I would say that there are elements in the party system that gave them a certain control on political life, and it makes them less sensitive to the opinion of the citizenship and the electorate in general. One of the peculiarities of the process of reform, electoral reform, and reform of the party system in Mexico is that it gave solid guarantees to the already established political parties. So basically, this is a system very beneficial to, I would say, the three main political parties, the PRI, the PAN, and the PRD. And maybe this is why they are not so sensitive to that enthusiasm that you are referring to. They receive very generous public funds in order to undertake their activities. the last electoral campaign. In the last electoral campaign, it was something that amounted to more than $500 million in order to support their activity. Every year we receive almost half of it to undertake their ordinary activities. It's very hard for new political parties. Basically, the new political parties, like this time there were 2 new political parties that got 2% of the vote, but it's very hard for the new political parties to grow unless they go into coalition with the established political parties. So maybe if there would be some type of flexibilization of the party system, it would force the political parties to be more sensitive to the citizens' demands. Also, I guess that the fact that there is no consecutive re-election in Mexico also tends to strengthen the political parties and to weaken the individual politicians. So maybe if there was a change to that constitutional provision, that would help to have more sensitive political parties. Yes?
It is not really the concern about the kind of left that we have in Mexico. Left that is more close to a populist discourse instead of a more modern approach.
Yeah.
What do you think after the election with López Obrador radicalization and with the perception in a large part of the left that now that they went through the institutional channels were cheated by the right and not respected what could be a fair success and the position that now PRD is taking to support, at least at the moment, the strategies followed by López Obrador. Do you think that is closer or it's more difficult, the possibility of having a more modern left in Mexico, being from PRD or coming from a different option?
Well, basically I share your concern about the left in Mexico. When I was mentioning that, when you look at the results of the election, you find out that yes, López Obrador did not win the presidency, and there was no B plan in order to think of what to do, having lost the election. But on the other hand, it's the first time that the PRD has such a strong delegation in Congress. So I guess that another way to look at the situation would have been to say, okay, we lost the election, we're going to contest the election at the legal level, but if we lose, we're going to concede the victory to López Obrador, and maybe that in 3 years we're going to win the majority at the Congress level, and maybe that in 6 years we will have a strongest chance to win the presidency. Why the PRD, López Obrador, members of the coalition did not think that way, I don't know. No, I guess that I know, but I think that it would have been a more modern way of appreciating the situation and of designing a strategy for the future. At the same time, there are things that I think have a certain weight in the explanation of the situation. First, the PRD is not a very institutionalized political party. Second, the PRD, in its very short history, the PRD has been depending most of the time of a very strong figure or personality. Before it was Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, and now Andrés Manuel López Obrador ended up substituting the charismatic figure of Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas. So I think that it's something that is part of the very short history of the PRD. And during those moments when the charismatic figure is very strong, when it has a strong political appeal, most of the time it is when the PRD looks more like a social movement and recurs to strategies of social mobilization than when the PRD does not have such a strong figure, individualistic figure. So I guess that it's part of the explanation. And then there is another problem, but it's very difficult to grasp, and it has to do with history, it has to do with culture, it has to do with how in a very unequal society where there is no tradition of strong leftist party, how you get to the people. And I guess that would be an almost general problem to Latin American countries or a few Latin American countries. So that populist tradition is very, very strong. And it is so strong that basically when you looked at the Proyecto Alternativo de Nación, it was like a nostalgic manifest of the past in a certain way. You know, it was like trying to reproduce the golden age of the post-revolutionary Mexico. So I don't know. That would be my answer, you know, and it's something that I think that we have to work on, and I also think that the leftist politicians in Mexico will have to work on. Last weekend, during the National Council of the PRD, they announced that next May there is going to be an extraordinary Congress of the PRD in order to lead to the re-foundation of the PRD. I don't know what's going to come out from that Congress, but we'll have to watch it. Yeah, please.
Yes, I have three questions.
Okay.
First, I'd like to push a bit more about this question on the left.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think are the short and medium-term consequences of AMLO's post-electoral actions on the left?
That's a good question.
The second question has to do more with fraud. Part of AMLO's post-electoral strategy was charging fraude hormiga. I'd like to know what you think about fraude hormiga. Do you find it problematic? Do you find it difficult to prove? And then for my third question, I'd like to push a bit more about the issue of governance and the future of governance in Mexico. So Fox's sexenio showed us many things about the current Mexican political system, one of which being the importance of Congress in getting things done. So what do you think the interaction will be between Congress and Calderon? Specifically, will there be more gridlock than we saw between Fox and the Congress? And also, what issues do you think will be particularly contentious and difficult and will be tied up in Congress? And here, I don't mean issues of legitimacy. I mean, though I'm sure this will be very salient for Calderon. I mean more issues of politics, economics, society.
Okay. Short and medium and long-term prospects for the PRD.
Actually, no, not for the PRD, the left.
For the left in general.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, basically, I think it's going to depend on the political future of Andrés Manuel López Obrador. I think that this is why I was mentioning the problem of routinization of charisma. You know, how the PRD and the left in general, because there is a possibility that the refoundation of the PRD would be oriented toward the inclusion of Convergencia, of El Partido del Trabajo, you know, in a new political movement, no, or political party. So there is a possibility that that will happen. Short and long-term prospects for Andrés Manuel López Obrador. Personally, I think that the best thing for him would have been to get more and more involved in the party, in his party's affairs, and trying to be, again, maybe the president of the PRD. But I think that this is not the type of situation he is comfortable with. So this is why is decided that he was not, in the end, he was not going to form a shadow cabinet with members, with deputies and senators, following a more, I don't know, parliamentarian or British way, but that he will create a, how do you call it, gobierno legítimo, basically surrounded by his old collaborators, you know, the people who were with him in the government of the GDF. So I think that he has problems seeing his future within a formal organization, you know. And as long as that will happen, it's going to be very difficult for the PRD, and I think that there are going to be a lot of tensions. Regarding the actual political situation, for example, we have seen in Tabasco, where Andrés Manuel López Obrador has been campaigning during the last 3 weeks of the campaign, that I would say that in general, people did not approve of his post-electoral strategy. And I think that it was important in the loss of the defeat of his candidate in Tabasco. But on the other hand, and that's the problem, if the government is not able to solve the problem in Oaxaca, and as long as there is going to be a social mobilization in Oaxaca, there is going to be a temptation on the part of the PRD to assume its role as a social movement, and then López Obrador will have an important role to play. Fraude hormiga, it's very difficult. It is so difficult, you know. You know, the only way, I wouldn't say that it was a perfect election. I think that there were many, many mistakes. The system is complicated. The people, well, they are trained, you know, they have 3 hours training in order to participate in the organization of the election. So I can understand that they make mistakes, and a lot of mistakes. Okay. Maybe people could say that the teachers' union had a role to play in that fraude hormiga. But even that way, you would need someone very, very intelligent in order to organize, you know, that fraude hormiga in the 131,000 polling stations in Mexico. So I don't really think that there was a fraude hormiga. What I do think, however, is that there are a lot of imperfections in the Mexican electoral law, that maybe the conditions of the election were not the best, but then again, I think that all political parties have a responsibility in that situation. You know that between the year 2000 and 2005, there were something like 40, I don't remember exactly, 41 or 42 initiatives that were presented in the Congress in order to reform the electoral law. Those initiatives came from the executive, the different political parties, and so on and so forth. During every period of what they call ordinary period of sessions of the legislature, the last 2 legislatures, people were thinking that there was going to be an extraordinary session in order to discuss the necessary reforms to the electoral law. And none of the political parties insisted on the urgency of those electoral laws. So I think that there is, all parties have a responsibility in the situation. Governance now. Governance. Okay. Calderon has a very different political profile than Vicente Fox. Calderon has been twice a member of Congress, a deputy, at the federal level. He's been once a member of the Legislative Assembly of the Federal District. He's been the general secretary of his political party at a time when there were a lot of negotiations between political parties in order basically to reform the electoral laws. And he was also the president of his political party when they approved the last reform to the electoral law in 1996. So it's a person who has a very different knowledge of the Mexican political system than Vicente Fox. He has not formulated or expressed public criticism to Vicente Fox, but in the last few months we have seen very clearly where his strategy would differ from Vicente Fox's strategy. He had said during the campaign that he believed, because he belongs also to the Christian Democrat wing of his political party, very close to, in his younger days, to Germany and to Chile, where, as you know, the Christian Democrats govern in coalition with other political parties. So he has expressed his will to form a kind of government of coalition. I say a kind of because it's not a parliamentary system, it's a presidential system. So he is very conscious of that. He is very conscious also that one of Fox's mistakes is that maybe Fox or his advisors thought that they were not in Mexico but in the US. And if you have a popular president, the president can use his popularity in order to influence the vote of the members of Congress. But this is not the way it works in Mexico. Calderon knows it very well, and he's been criticizing the way that Vicente Fox related to the Congress. Okay. This being said, the situation is very difficult. It's very, very difficult. So even if Calderon knows all that and knows very well how the political system works in Mexico, it's going to be very complicated. And the Oaxaca situation is a good example of how it can be very complicated. Because basically, if the PAN and the government try to maintain a certain level of cooperation with the PRI, it's going to make it very difficult. It's going to make the relation with the PRD more difficult. So it's a situation where I think it will be very difficult to reach an equilibrium between the political forces.
I'm afraid with that, no, we have finished. Thank you very much, Professor.